Did you know that the rebuilding of the temple in Jerusalem, one of the greatest miracles after the Babylonian exile, was led by a man named Zerubbabel? He faced enormous challenges, but he never lost faith. In this video, we'll explore how Zerubbabel helped restore the worship of God and rebuild what seemed impossible. If you're interested in stories of overcoming obstacles and unwavering faith, subscribe now and follow this epic journey. Zerubbabel, the leader who rebuilt the temple in Jerusalem. Zerubbabel's story is one of the most impressive in the Bible. He was a man chosen by God to lead the Jews back to Jerusalem after the long Babylonian exile, a period of about 70 years of suffering and separation from their land. But what makes his story so special? How did he, a man with deep roots in the kingdom of Judah, manage to accomplish such a great and difficult mission? Zerubbabel was not just a political or military leader. He was a key player in the spiritual restoration of Israel. He was the grandson of Jeconiah, the last king of Judah before the exile, and was chosen by God to be responsible for one of the greatest milestones in the history of the people of Israel, the reconstruction of the temple in Jerusalem. When the Babylonian Empire was defeated by the Persians, King Cyrus of Persia allowed the Jews to return to their land. The vast majority of Jews wanted to return to Jerusalem, but the challenge was immense. It was not just a matter of rebuilding a devastated city. It was necessary to restore the worship of God, reconnect the people with their history, and rebuild the temple, which had been destroyed by the Babylonians. And it was Zerubbabel who took the lead in this monumental task, the challenge of rebuilding the temple. The temple in Jerusalem was not just a building. It was the spiritual heart of Israel, the place where God dwelt among his people. When the Babylonians destroyed the temple, it was as if a part of the identity of the people of Israel had been ripped away. Returning to Jerusalem did not only mean rebuilding walls and houses, but also restoring God's presence among his people. Upon arriving in Jerusalem, Zerubbabel faced an almost impossible task. He did not have great resources or a large military force to protect the work. Furthermore, Israel's enemies, such as the Samaritans and other neighboring peoples, were fiercely opposed to the rebuilding of the temple. Many tried to discredit Zerubbabel and prevent the work from moving forward, using threats and political intrigue. But Zerubbabel, with unshakable faith, did not let himself be discouraged. He relied on God's promises and the words of the prophet Haggai, which encouraged him not to give up. It was his resilience, his perseverance in the face of difficulties, that made the difference. He managed to gather the necessary resources, motivate the people, and finally begin the rebuilding of the temple, the spiritual restoration of Israel. The rebuilding of the temple was not just an architectural project. It was, above all, a spiritual restoration. The people of Israel needed to return to worshiping God in a worthy manner, restoring communion with their Creator. Zerubbabel understood this deeply, and by leading the construction, he also led the people in a return to true worship. When the temple was finally completed, the celebration was grand. The people gathered in joy and gratitude because they knew that the work was not just the work of human hands, but a work that God had directed. Zerubbabel's return to Jerusalem and the rebuilding of the temple were clear signs that God had not abandoned Israel, and that he would fulfill his promises, no matter how great the challenge. Zerubbabel's legacy. Zerubbabel not only helped restore the temple in Jerusalem, but he was also a symbol of hope for the people of Israel. He was a leader who, in times of crisis, stood firm and trusted in God, facing adversity with courage and determination. The temple, once restored, not only signified the rebuilding of a building, but also the renewal of faith and the reaffirmation that the people of Israel had been chosen to fulfill a great divine purpose. But Zerubbabel's legacy is not limited to his leadership during the rebuilding of the temple. He is also remembered as part of the lineage of Jesus Christ, being mentioned in the genealogy of Christ in the Gospel of Matthew. This highlights the importance of Zerubbabel not only to the history of Israel, but also to the fulfillment of the messianic promises. The return of Zerubbabel as inspiration. The story of Zerubbabel is a lesson in perseverance, faith, and leadership. In times of crisis and uncertainty, It is possible to see that with courage and trust in God, even the most impossible tasks can be accomplished. Zerubbabel did not give up in the face of obstacles and fulfilled the mission that God entrusted to him, restoring the Temple of Jerusalem and, with it, the faith of the people of Israel. He is an example for all of us of how we should trust in the promises of God. Even when difficulties seem insurmountable. Like Zerubbabel, we must be leaders of our own faith, not allowing challenges to distract us from God's purpose for our lives. The rebuilding of the temple was not only a physical work, but also a spiritual work, a work that God used to rebuild his people and renew his covenant with them. And Zerubbabel, through his leadership, became one of God's greatest instruments for this great task. The return from the Babylonian exile, God's great promise fulfilled. The Babylonian exile was one of the darkest periods in Israel's history. Jerusalem, God's holy city, was destroyed by the Babylonian Empire, and Solomon's temple, a sacred symbol of God's presence among the people, was burned to its foundations. Amidst the devastation, the Babylonians took much of the Israelite population captive to Babylon, far from their promised land. It was a time of great suffering and desolation for the Jews, and many wondered if they would ever see Jerusalem again. However, there was a promise of hope. The prophet Jeremiah, inspired by God, had prophesied that this exile would not last forever. God declared that after 70 years, the people of Israel would return to their land. Although this promise was hard to believe for those living in captivity, it continued to be the light at the end of the tunnel, a beacon of hope that everyone waited for. The promise of return seemed almost impossible to fulfill, especially given the greatness of the Babylonian Empire and the destruction of everything the Jews had known. However, God had a plan. The great turning point came when Cyrus, king of Persia, conquered Babylon and, in a surprising and significant move, allowed the Jews to return to their homeland to rebuild the temple in Jerusalem. This decree by Cyrus was undoubtedly a divine action, clear proof that God had not abandoned his people and that he had remembered the promise he had made. Zerubbabel, the leader who led the people to fulfill the promise. In this scenario of renewed hope, Zerubbabel stood out as the leader chosen by God to lead the people of Israel back to Jerusalem. He was a man of royal lineage, grandson of Jeconiah, the last king of Judah, and received from Cyrus the command to lead the group of exiles who would return to Jerusalem. This was not a simple return of exiles, but the fulfillment of a promise from God that had echoed for generations. Zerubbabel's return to the land of Israel was not only an act of faith, but a sign that the history of the people of Israel was about to be rewritten. A new chapter was being opened. Zerubbabel not only led the physical journey back to Jerusalem, but was also responsible for initiating the spiritual restoration of the people. Upon arriving in Jerusalem, the people saw the land devastated and the temple destroyed, a symbol of God's presence that seemed to have disappeared with the destruction of the city. However, Zerubbabel knew that the first step could not be merely physical. Restoring the relationship with God had to be the priority. And it was with this focus that he began leading the rebuilding of the temple. The challenging rebuilding of the temple in Jerusalem. The temple in Jerusalem was much more than just a building. It was the place where God had chosen to dwell among his people, the place where the Jews offered their sacrifices and worshiped God in community. Its destruction represented a profound loss, not only for Israel, but also for God himself, who dwelt there in a tangible way. The rebuilding of the temple, therefore, was a spiritual and physical challenge of immense proportions. But Zerubbabel was determined to do God's will, no matter the difficulties. The beginning of the rebuilding was an explosion of excitement and faith. As the first stone was laid, the people saw God's promise being fulfilled before their eyes. It was as if a new breath of life had been breathed into Israel, and renewed hope spread throughout the people. But, like any great undertaking, the rebuilding would not be easy. Soon, the Jews faced fierce opposition from their neighbors, who feared that strengthening Israel would mean weakening their own kingdoms. Samaritans, Ammonites, and other neighboring peoples tried in every way to sabotage the work. The pressure was so great that the construction of the temple was temporarily halted. But Zerubbabel, with the help of the high priest Joshua and the support of the prophets Haggai and Zechariah, never lost focus. Haggai's message in particular brought a revival of faith to the people, reminding them that God was with them, and that with his help, the work would be completed. Zerubbabel's persistence and trust in God's promises were the keys to overcoming the obstacles and completing the rebuilding of the temple. Finally, the work was completed and the temple was dedicated with great joy and celebration. The new temple was not a replica of the old, but had a presence of renewed holiness. It became a symbol of God's faithfulness to his people and the restoration of his relationship with them. The return from Babylonian exile and the rebuilding of the temple were not only historical milestones, but also spiritual milestones. They represented the restoration of true worship and the continuation of God's plan for Israel. The relevance of the return from exile for today. The return from Babylonian exile and the rebuilding of the temple in Jerusalem are not just historical events that belong to the past. They carry profound lessons for all of us, especially about God's faithfulness and the power of perseverance in the face of hardship. Just as the Jews faced immense challenges in rebuilding the temple, we too face adversity in our lives. But the story of Zerubbabel teaches us that when we trust in God and stand firm in his promises, nothing is impossible. The return from Babylonian exile is a reminder that God never forgets his people and that in times of crisis, he always provides a way out. Zerubbabel was merely an instrument in God's hands, but his leadership and faith were crucial to the fulfillment of God's promises. The rebuilding of the temple was not just a physical act, but a spiritual act of restoring God's presence among his people. The legacy of Zerubbabel. Zerubbabel is an immortal figure in the history of Israel, and his journey back to Jerusalem and the rebuilding of the temple is one of the greatest testimonies of faith and perseverance. He not only led the people physically, but also led them back to God. The return from Babylonian exile was the moment of a new covenant, a new beginning for Israel, and Zerubbabel was the leader chosen by God to guide this process. Today, Zerubbabel's story inspires us to trust in God, to persevere in difficulties, and to never give up on his promises, because he is faithful and fulfills everything he promises. The restoration of God's worship. The spiritual role of Zerubbabel. Zerubbabel was more than just a political or military leader. He was the restorer of God's worship, the central figure in Israel's spiritual renewal after the Babylonian exile. His mission was not only to restore the people to their land, but also to restore to them the heart of their faith so that they could once again worship God in the way he commanded. This was accomplished primarily through the rebuilding of the temple in Jerusalem, which was more than a physical work. It was the visible symbol that the people of Israel could once again meet with God in worship and obedience. In the Old Testament, the temple was the spiritual center of the people of Israel. It was the place where the Israelites met with God, offering sacrifices and prayers according to the laws he had established through Moses. The destruction of the temple, then, was not just an architectural loss, but a disruption in the people's relationship with God. During the Babylonian exile, the Israelites were deprived of this direct communion, and the rebuilding of the temple, led by Zerubbabel, meant much more than restoring a physical structure. It meant restoring the spiritual bond between God and his people. The spiritual struggle to restore worship. Zerubbabel's task was not easy. He faced not only the political and logistical challenges of rebuilding the temple, but also the spiritual resistance that arose from the long period of separation from God. Many of the exiles had grown accustomed to Babylonian practices, and the transition back to true worship required a profound renewal of heart. Zerubbabel knew that for the rebuilding of the temple to be successful, the people of Israel needed to turn back to God with all their hearts. Zerubbabel's leadership, along with the high priest Joshua, was crucial in re-establishing worship practices according to the law of Moses. He led the people in re-establishing the sacrifices and rituals necessary to please God, and the people, despite their difficulties, came together in faith to make it happen. The rebuilding of the temple, thus, symbolized the spiritual rebuilding of Israel. as if each stone laid was a step toward the complete restoration of their relationship with their Creator. The opposition, however, was fierce. Enemies around Israel, who feared the return of the people and the strengthening of Jerusalem, tried to sabotage the work of rebuilding the temple. But Zerubbabel, encouraged by the prophets Haggai and Zechariah, persevered. He knew that the success of this work lay not in his own strength, but in God's faithfulness to his promises. Zerubbabel trusted that if God had led the people back, he would also ensure that the work would be completed. And so it was. Zerubbabel's legacy, hope and restoration. Zerubbabel was not only the leader of the return from exile, he became a symbol of hope for the people of Israel. He was living proof that God does not abandon those to whom he makes promises. Even after 70 years of suffering and captivity, God kept his word, and Zerubbabel was the chosen instrument to demonstrate this faithfulness. But Zerubbabel's legacy goes beyond his political and spiritual leadership. He is also a key figure in the genealogy of Jesus Christ, as recorded in the New Testament. In Matthew 1 verse 12, Zerubbabel is mentioned as a direct ancestor of Jesus, establishing a clear connection between the restoration of Israel in the Old Testament and the fulfillment of the promise of a Messiah who would come to save the world. His royal lineage, which traces back to King David, places him at the center of God's plan for the salvation of humanity. The construction of the temple under his leadership was not only the re-establishment of a place of worship, but also the beginning of a larger plan, which would culminate in the coming of the Savior. Through Zerubbabel's leadership, the people of Israel were reminded that true restoration could only occur when they returned to God in genuine worship. Zerubbabel not only restored the temple in Jerusalem, but he helped restore the hearts of the people of Israel, leading them to a deep and lasting spiritual renewal. His legacy is not limited to a physical building. He left an indelible mark on the spiritual history of God's people. The impact of restored worship. With the completion of the rebuilding of the temple, the people of Israel were once again able to gather to worship God according to the law of Moses. Their return to worshiping God was not only an act of obedience, but also an expression of gratitude for God's faithfulness in restoring them after so many years of suffering. The dedication of the new temple was an event of great joy and celebration, and the people saw that God's presence was once again with them. This restoration of worship to God had a profound impact on the lives of the people of Israel. The practice of sacrifices and rituals was not just a fulfillment of religious obligations, but a way of restoring their covenant with God. Each sacrifice offered was an act of reconciliation, an expression of trust that God would forgive their sins and renew their relationship with him. The rebuilding of the temple, therefore, was the culmination of a long process of spiritual restoration. But the true meaning of restored worship lay not only in the external ceremonies, but in the internal transformation of the people. Zerubbabel, in fulfilling the divine mission of rebuilding the temple, also fulfilled the deeper mission of restoring the heart of Israel. He not only brought the people back physically to their land, but he also led them back to true worship, which can only be achieved through obedience, repentance, and faith in God. Zerubbabel's eternal legacy. Zerubbabel was not just the leader of a nation. He was the spiritual restorer of Israel. His work in rebuilding the temple in Jerusalem was just the tip of the iceberg, a visible reflection of a deeper transformation that was taking place in the hearts of the people. His faithfulness to God, his courage in the face of adversity, and his determination to restore true worship forever marked the history of Israel. Today, Zerubbabel's legacy teaches us about the importance of returning to God, restoring our fellowship with him, and trusting in the faithfulness of God's promises, even in times of difficulty. Like Zerubbabel, we are called to be instruments of restoration, both in our own lives and in the lives of those around us. God continues to fulfill his promises, and like Zerubbabel, we can be part of that divine plan by helping to restore true worship and faithfulness to God in today's world. Zerubbabel's enduring legacy, a leader of faith and spiritual renewal. Zerubbabel was not just a political or military leader, but a shining example of faith, courage, and perseverance in times of great adversity. His life and leadership represent the restoration not only of a physical temple, but also of a people who, after decades of exile and suffering, were given the opportunity to re-establish their relationship with God. His legacy endures to this day, not only as the man responsible for rebuilding the temple in Jerusalem, but as the symbol of a profound spiritual renewal that reverberates through the generations. In leading the return from Babylonian exile and beginning the daunting task of rebuilding the temple, Zerubbabel faced challenges that would have been insurmountable to many. He dealt with a discouraged population, many still traumatized by years of captivity, and he had to overcome resistance from neighbors and enemies who feared Israel's rise. But even in the face of such opposition, Zerubbabel did not waver. He maintained his trust in God and moved forward with courage, knowing that he was fulfilling a divine mission, destined to restore true worship and establish a new and lasting future. Or the temple as the spiritual center of the people of Israel again. The reconstruction of the temple was not just a feat of engineering or architecture. It was a symbolic and profound act of spiritual renewal. For the people of Israel, the temple represented the presence of God in their midst, the place where true worship and sacrifices took place, and where their relationship with God was kept alive. The return to the temple meant the restoration of everything they had lost during their exile: freedom, peace, and, above all, closeness to the Creator. The faithfulness of Zerubbabel, the importance of perseverance in the divine mission. Zerubbabel's life teaches us a valuable lesson about faithfulness and perseverance. Even in the face of difficulties, he remained focused on the mission God gave him. His leadership was not marked only by extraordinary deeds or visible achievements, but by the example of how to trust God in the most difficult situations. He knew that the mission was not about him, but about fulfilling God's promises to his people. Each stone placed in the rebuilding of the temple represented not only the restoration of a sacred place, but also the faithfulness of God, who never abandons those who trust in him. Zerubbabel also faced an internal battle amid the suffering of his people, having to deal with the fatigue and lack of motivation of the exiles. But he understood that the mission did not depend on the people's spirit, but on their faithfulness to the Word of God. This led him to persevere and not give up, even when it seemed that the work would never be completed. His trust in God and his power was not just theoretical, but something that he lived and demonstrated daily, motivating the people to do the same. Spiritual restoration through obedience, Zerubbabel's return, and the rebuilding of the temple were not just about restoring the physical infrastructure, but about restoring the true worship of God. Zerubbabel's mission, with the help of the high priest Joshua, was guided by the urgent need to reestablish the sacred rituals, sacrifices, and purity of worship. The people needed to understand that worship of God could not be set aside, for it was the bond that held them together as a separate nation blessed by God. The worship that Zerubbabel and the leaders of Israel restored was not merely ceremonial, but deeply spiritual. It required obedience to the Lord and commitment to his word. By leading the people in rebuilding the temple, Zerubbabel was also leading them back to a commitment to divine law, purity of worship, and obedience to God's will. True worship was not just an act of sacrifice and ritual, but a genuine surrender of the heart and a constant pursuit of holiness. Zerubbabel in history. An example of hope and purpose, Zerubbabel's legacy goes beyond the stones and bricks of the restored temple. He became a symbol of hope for the people of Israel, showing that even after a period of devastation and separation from God, there was always an opportunity for restoration. Zerubbabel proved that with faith in God and perseverance, it is possible to rebuild what has been destroyed and even see dreams of restoration come true. His leadership made the people believe again in a prosperous future, and more importantly, in the transforming power of God. This example of hope is even more relevant in the context of Zerubbabel's royal lineage. In the New Testament, he is mentioned as a direct ancestor of Jesus Christ, establishing a vital connection between the physical restoration of the temple and the spiritual restoration that would occur with the coming of the Messiah. Zerubbabel did not know it while he was rebuilding the temple, but his faithfulness served as the basis for the divine plan that would culminate in the coming of Jesus Christ, the true temple of God, who, through his death and resurrection, would permanently restore the relationship between God and humanity. The importance of Zerubbabel's legacy for us today. Zerubbabel's example has much to teach us, not only about leadership, but also about how to live according to the divine mission, even in the midst of difficulties. Like him, we are called to trust God, even when the task seems impossible. We are called to keep our faith firm, to persevere, and to believe that God always fulfills his promises, regardless of adversity. His faithfulness never fails, and his power is greater than any challenge we may face. Zerubbabel also teaches us about the importance of true worship and obedience to God. He not only restored a physical temple, but he reminds us that our bodies and hearts must be the true temple where God desires to dwell. The spiritual restoration that began with him continues to be an example for all of us, demonstrating that through obedience, faith, and trust in God, we can live in a way that honors and glorifies God. Pray to him. In short, Zerubbabel's legacy is not limited to the past. His life and mission continue to speak to us today, reminding us that through faithfulness, courage, and true worship, we can be instruments of restoration in the world. Like Zerubbabel, we can help restore true worship and lead others to experience the transformative power of God in their lives. If you are connecting with this powerful story and want to explore more inspiring lessons like this, be sure to subscribe to our channel. That way, you won't miss any updates and can be part of our community that seeks to understand and live faith in a deeper way.